Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Can you imagine waking up one morning, checking into your social media account and finding out that your loved one has been killed? I want you to take a moment here and think about this, about the fact that you will return home safely at the end of the day. This is a basic human and civic right that we take for granted. It doesn't even cross our mind what a big blessing it is to have security, peace and safety in and around the places we live, for ourselves and for our loved ones. The story of torture, violence and incarceration is a decades and decades old story in Indian-occupied Kashmir, a region where, according to a survey conducted by Action Aid International, 59% of men and almost 40% of women are suffering from severe depression. In Indian-occupied Kashmir, there is no surety of seeing your loved ones at the end of the day, making it home themselves. With endless aggressive search and cordon operations underway, there is no safety in one's home either. When 29-year-old Rizwan Pandit, a resident of Jammu and Kashmir's Pulwama district, when he heard a knock on the door late in the evening on Sunday night, he didn't know that this would be the last time he'd be with his family. Unidentified security personnel entered, locked the women in one room, and then they searched the entire house. When they left, they took Pandit with him. Now, a few days later, the family found out from social media that their son was killed in police detention. Pandit was allegedly lodged in the infamous cargo camp of the Police Special Operations Group in Srinagar. Rizwan was one of the youngest school principals in that area, and according to his brother, he had a bachelor's degree in education, a postgrad degree in chemistry, and was also planning to pursue his PhD. Not anymore. This is the first custodial death reportedly to take place this year. The last one, as we know from reports, was also of a teacher, and it took place in 2016. The news of Pandit's death has drawn a wave of criticism from political leaders from the valley's mainstream political parties. Kashmiri separatist leader Mirwaiz Umar Farooq says, and he tweeted this earlier, let me read out the tweet as you can see it on the screens. Distraught at the brutal custodial killing of young Rizwan Ahmed of Avantipura. The brutal killing once again exposes the helplessness, vulnerability and insecurity to the lives of Kashmiris as impunity of the authorities keeps rising. The former Chief Minister Umar Abdullah, he tweeted also, I had hoped custodial deaths were a thing of our dark past. This is an unacceptable development and must be investigated in a transparent, time-bound manner. Exemplary punishment must be handed out to the killers of this young man. People's Democratic Party President and former Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti tweeted also that, and I quote here, innocent men hauled up from their homes for interrogation return home only in coffins now. The government of India's repressive approach leaves young, educated men vulnerable who are forced to take up arms. Stop using Kashmir to exhibit your sick chauvinistic nationalism. We have suffered enough. So condemnation one side, atrocities continue on the other side unabated. What is the world doing about it, and whether there is another side to this story, another facet that we are missing here? Let's talk to our guests about this and try and understand what the situation is right now in Indian-occupied Kashmir. For that, I would like to welcome our guests. We have from Srinagar a barrister, a lawyer, Mr. Rao Mujtaba, and also we have Mr. Prabodh Jamwal. He's the editor of Kashmir Times. You are joining us from Jammu. Welcome to Newswire. I want to start with you, Mr. Jamwal. When you heard of the story, when you heard of Rizwan Pandit's situation and that he had died, what was the first thought that came to your mind?
It's very unfortunate that it is one of those incidents which have been continuing for the last 3 decades. And there is no accountability, or there is no fixation of the responsibility why youth or anybody for that matter, men, women, children, whosoever it is, are detained and are unfortunately tortured and killed in custody. There has been condemnation from mainstream political parties, from opposition parties and general public. And the first thing was how to go about it and how to look at the situation, because such a thing leads to spontaneous protestation, not only in Srinagar, but also the hometown of this unfortunate young man who was looking forward to fulfilling his dream of further education and other things. But it's very unfortunate that we have heard from the authorities that they have ordered ordered a magistrate inquiry. But again, we are always skeptical about these issues because hundreds and thousands of magistrate inquiries have been ordered in the last 50 years or more than that, not only in Kashmir, but also other parts of India. But unfortunately, there's no result or there's no accountability fixed for these people.
So, Mr. Mujtaba, you heard what Mr. Jamwal said about the impunity with these, how these forces act. So, when Umar Abdullah comes out and demands exemplary punishment in a time-bound inquiry, do you have any hope that this time maybe we might see some justice?
See, the phenomenon of the custodial killings or the torture or any type of the human rights abuses is not new for the Kashmir folk. We have seen it from since the decades, almost from last 30 years. What we can expect from the NC Umar Abdullah and from the PDP government, because at the time of when the Mahbub Mufti was in power, more than 16,000 palliative victims are in their political history. And when the Umar Abdullah was in chair, the more of the custodial killings were in his era. So the custodial killings or the torture or any other human rights abuses are not new to the Kashmir. All that what changes, it is the name and the age of the person. Nothing like that.
So let me ask you this then. When you say, sorry to cut you here. Let me ask you this then, Mr. Mujtaba. When you say this is not new to Kashmir, obviously this is definitely not new. There have been enough cases, though there is a big question on the number, because there is no official data that confirms this many thousands or this many hundred. Why is this data missing? Maybe this will help us understand the loopholes or the actual laws in place that allow security forces to carry out these killings with impunity. Could you shed some light on that?
I don't feel that the Amnesty International, neither the Amnesty International nor the Human Rights Watch, these are the international organizations. I don't feel that the government of India nor the government of the Jammu and Kashmir has given the consent for their free and the impartial probes in Jammu and Kashmir. But no. According to the non-official states, we have the figures. We have more than 10,000 custodial killings cases in Jammu and Kashmir.
So when you say you don't feel that the Indian government has allowed it, it's either they have allowed it or they haven't allowed it. It's a very clear distinction, isn't it? They haven't allowed it. Multiple times ICRC has gone and requested access to different, these torture cells, to different parts of Jammu and Kashmir, each time denied. Mr. Jamwal, let me bring you into this conversation. Maybe you can shed some light. When there are special laws allowing, with impunity, security forces to carry out search and cordon operations, as they call it, isn't this the very root of the problem right there?
Yes, it's unfortunate. The authorities, whosoever it is, whether it is the armed forces which are operating, and in army men, Air Force, Navy, and then paramilitary forces, whosoever it is, they are supposed to give the information to the family within 24 hours. That is the charter or the standard operating procedure, whatever they say. But unfortunately, none of them is followed, and no information is given. And first of all, there was a confusion whether he was arrested by the Special Operations or the National Intelligence Agency or the National Investigation Agency. But unfortunately, both of them, at the first instance, the NIA came out with an official denied they had never caught this gentleman, they had never detained this gentleman, though then the responsibility lies with the Special Operations of the Jammu and Kashmir Police. But they have come out with a simple statement. We have ordered an inquiry and the internal police inquiry is also going on. But again, I'm repeating it here, that so many inquiries have been ordered, and what is the end result? Whether we can stop the killing of the people in the custody, or we can look forward to people who are called to the police stations or to the custody for interrogation, questioning, or whatever it is, and that they come alive to back to their homes, or they are reunited with their families.
Right, absolutely. And here I want to take a moment to show our viewers what Rizwan Pandit's brother had after his interaction with the local police, trying to find out about the whereabouts of his brother. Let's take a listen.
How it happened in their custody, how it happened. They are completely responsible bodies. They should be brought before the court. They should be sentenced to death. That we want.
There you heard Mubashir, the brother of Rizwan Pandit, saying very clearly in another interview also, where he's quoted the police as saying, well, now we've handed your brother over to cargo and this is completely out of our control. That sentiment right there highlights exactly what you said, Mr. Jamwal. And here I want to bring you in, Mr. Rao, when we were talking about different laws. Tell me a little about the Disturbed Area Act, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and also the Public Safety Act, which is currently in effect in Jammu and Kashmir. And what does that allow and what does that mean for the civilians?
Words, these, whether the DAA or the PSA or the AFSPA, these are the anti-human rights laws. First of all, it must be very clear. And there is a total legal immunity to the armed forces that that even a subordinate officer can search even within a warrant, any house, any place. They can search, even they can kill a person on the basis of the suspicion also. When this speaks a lot about the legal immunity. Recently, a report has been submitted, published by the US departments that since last 3 decades, none of the armed person has been prosecuted for the human rights abuses. This speaks about a lot. So many of the cases we have seen, so many of FIRs has been lodged against the armed forces, against the human rights violations. But what happened? We have seen so many of the magisterial inquiries, the judicial commissions, but the public is unaware about the results and the outputs of such commissions. So we have totally lost faith on all the commissions or the inquiry commissions, even though we have the National Human Rights Commission, the State Human Rights Commissions, but all are different. They are the toothless tigers.
And isn't this also, in a way, these, as you call them, anti-human right laws, Mr. Jamwal, aren't they also a violation of the Indian Constitution, Article 21 and 22?
Yes, definitely. The Constitution is very clear on these issues. Personal liberty, freedom of movement, freedom of speech and expression. But unfortunately, in a conflict situation like Kashmir, everything has become a sort of casualty to the free run of not only the armed forces, paramilitary forces, or anybody who is operating with a gun in Kashmir.
So help me understand, Mr. Jamwal, not just me and for the viewers' sake, also the debate about collateral damage in a conflict zone. And this is a narrative that is heard across, whether we're talking about Yemen or Syria or any war zone, Palestine, Gaza. The question about collateral damage is always, in a way, kind of offering impunity to the case. Here, the Indian government continues to say that this is just a pocket full of people who protest, who are miscreants in Jammu and Kashmir. The rest of them are with us. Doesn't this go against this narrative?
Yes, definitely. We cannot say that we open fire, we resort to pellet firing to avoid collateral damage or something like that, or when we are fighting some gunman in the name of counter-insurgency operation or something like that, or do not blow up the houses, that it is not collateral damage or something like that. But in a conflict situation, when you do not allow a person a free movement, free speech and expression, and freedom of doing whatever they want to do, or do not allow people to peacefully demonstrate or hold protest demonstration against any sort of injustice done to them, then unfortunately this is leading to a complete impunity of everybody who is engaged in counter-insurgency or counter-militancy operations, not only in Kashmir, but anywhere in the world. And then the collateral damage, in the name of collateral damage or whatever the narrative is going on, unfortunately, precious human lives are being lost.
And doesn't it sort of spur on a vicious cycle where when
Yes.
demonstrators come out to protest with stones, are shot in the face with pellet guns, either maiming them or blinding them for life? Doesn't this kind of just add to the indigenous movement that India refuses to recognize?
And that is what I want to suggest, that we have to take care of the basic issues. What happens when the people want to hold protest demonstrations or just want to express their anger, not only against certain things which are their basic rights, but against anything else, even if they demand water, power, or regular municipal facilities, they are targeted by the paramilitary forces or something like that. So it brings into focus the vicious cycle that has been operating for the last 3 decades, and we are just losing precious lives.
So, Mr. Rao, if you can very quickly summarize for us what options are available now to Rizwan Pandit's family to take this case to court, and how would they proceed?
See, in the past, we have seen so many of the commissions and the ministerial inquiry, but nothing positive has come up. So the custodial killing of the young youth, a teacher by profession, once again, it exposes the helplessness, vulnerability, and the insecurity of the lives of the Kashmiris. But the family of the particular Rizwan, they should demand for the FIR against such agencies who took up such a Rizwan, innocent Rizwan, for an interrogation, and in return of that, his family received his copy. There must be an FIR against such agencies.
Okay.
Whoever the case may be, the police or the NIA.
Right, super. Thank you so much, Mr. Rao, for your valuable insight there. I want to come to you, Mr. Jamwal. We have maybe one case which I wish I could play the devil's advocate here. It happened in 2010, where the military court eventually sentenced a colonel and 3 other officers to life in prison. But in 2017, it was overturned by the Army Tribunal.
Yeah, Ayza, this is not the first case. Unfortunately, we have to go back into the history of such cases when the court-martial of the Special Tribunal held special inquiries into such cases, which were referred not only from Kashmir, but also other parts of India. The first one was the Patriwal killing, in which 5 civilians were first described as militants who were killed after they were chased or something like that happened, and they were held responsible for killing innocent civilians. But unfortunately, what happened, it was followed by 2 different inquiries, by the magisterial inquiry, police inquiry, and then a judicial inquiry. It indicted uniformed people, the armed forces people, not only half a dozen, but a dozen people, and more than 3 scores of people were examined in the process. But unfortunately, what happened? The inquiry continued for about 3 years. After that, it was handed over to the court-martial, and the Armed Forces Tribunal held it. And then it took such a long time, like I can say, as of today, it has happened more than 20 years back. But unfortunately, the impunity has been so high that whether they were indicted by the Armed Forces Tribunal court-martial or not, it has never seen the light of the day, or it was never publicized in the media. The case you are referring to in 2014, and everything was over in 2017 when the case was reverted. There are many other cases in which the court-martial has reversed the indictment of the armed forces people who were engaged in the counter-insurgency operations.
And usually the reasons are given there are that there's not enough evidence, which in itself is a problem, because if the victims' family members are not allowed to file the case properly, are not allowed to even file an FIR, then what to speak of evidence which is later destroyed. But with that, let me welcome another guest. Thank you so much, Mr. Prabodh Jamwal, for your input there. Here, I'd like to welcome Mr. Fahad Shah. You're an editor for the Kashmir Wala magazine, and you're talking to us from Delhi. Welcome to Newswire. Fahad, what's your take on what has happened? A very unfortunate incident of Rizwan Pandit losing his life to, once again, atrocities conducted by armed forces there in Jammu and Kashmir.
Well, you know, like this is one of the many incidents, I think, where such an incident has happened. But with this case, I don't think as journalists, like, we know enough of the details, what exactly has happened inside. The family has accused that he has been killed, but we haven't seen much of the investigation being made public. But in Kashmir, as like there is an history, like there are like a lot of probes are being called whenever there are civilian killings or whenever there is a custodial killing in past. But we end up seeing that those probes never see the light of the result. Like, during like it was very fascinating to see that the former chief minister Omar Abdullah or others are today demanding that there has to be an inquiry, there has to be a probe. But while they were in the power, while Umar was in power, 120 civilians were killed in 2010, and a commission was called for it. And surprisingly, the report of the commission has not been made public even today. So we do know that how these investigations and inquiries end up. So it would be really a big step if this particular incident would be taken to a logical end, and the family will get the justice, and they will exactly know what happened to their son while he was in custody. But looking at the history, one doesn't have much of the hope. But if the things in Kashmir need to be better politically and in regard of the human rights violations, then such investigations have to be conducted in a proper, independent, and result-oriented way.
It's interesting that you mentioned this. Again, a note of not much optimism here of how far this inquiry will go. But one of the things that we have heard often in various news reports of family members of victims is that these victims have been arrested on the mere appearance of the person and the way they are dressed. And in one case, it was reported that security officials put their hand on the chest of these victims to check whose heartbeat was racing, and the one whose was arrested and was never seen again.
Yeah, like there are different incidents that happen. Like I don't know, you have seen the news that after 2016 uprising, there were a lot of young people who were arrested after their cell phones were checked, after some of the pictures of the protest or something was found in their phones. So there is a lot of fear among the people. In South Kashmir, there were so many checkpoints that you have seen. There was this one prominent picture that got viral in which this army or police official was checking the laptop of one of the students on the road. So there have been several arrests, but what I'm trying to say with this incident, which apparently looks like a custodial killing, there should be a proper investigation, because otherwise it will be the same. People do not believe the justice system. Like we as journalists know 2010 uprising incidents, 2016 incidents, or other civilian killings that have happened in past, and their parents are still like protesting in the press colony, or they're going to court. They are still waiting for that justice, but nothing seemed to be happening in these inquiries. So anyone who is today demanding inquiries or the probes, all these the former chief ministers or the politicians, they should recall what their time had been in Kashmir. Well, they were in power. Well, they had the power to to deliver justice to these families, but nobody did that. So people in general do not have much of the hope of justice.
I hear you on that point, absolutely. But also it puts into position the world's role here, the world community's role here. The US State Department issued a human rights report which basically called for the removal of the Armed Forces Special Protection Act. And the acknowledgement of this, is there any acknowledgement amongst the current leadership, whether it's in Jammu and Kashmir or in the wider India?
About the removal
of the Armed Forces Special Protection Act, because it's a very controversial act that gives impunity to armed forces to basically carry out torture on without any explanation or accountability.
This act and the revocation of this act or any other thing, like revocation of Article 35A, 370, AFSPA, PSA, all these have become now political tools. You will see a lot of politicians talking about revocation of Article AFSPA just before the elections. Omar Abdullah, while he was in government, he said that I am trying to revoke it, but nothing happened. So any government that has come in Kashmir has not really been able to really do the revocation of AFSPA or do any other changes in those kinds of acts. But yes, there are a lot of people, even in India, or there are activists and other people who see this as the root of a lot of human rights violations. But I personally do not believe that AFSPA will change much in Kashmir now.
Right. And also when you say people within India recognize it, people across the world, I mean, there are countless number of declarations, resolution, whether it's the Geneva Convention 1949 or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and so on and so forth, that basically say that whatever these laws are in Jammu and Kashmir are against basic human rights.
Yeah, see, there are human rights violations, but one has to look at why are they human rights violations. There is an issue. This is a political issue. There is a conflict. There is gun on both sides of the political thought. So in between, the people get sandwiched, and there are violations from every side of the conflict. So the main issue is one has to look at the conflict itself. One has to look at how to address this politically rather than militarily.
Right. How to address this politically. Thank you so much, Mr. Fahad Shah, joining us from Delhi there for your valuable input. And with that, we have to take a quick short break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire. Russia has decided to deploy nuclear-capable 22 M3 strategic bombers to the Crimean Peninsula in response to the U.S. rolling out anti-ballistic missile defense systems in Romania. Now, this coincides with Russia also celebrating the 5th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. Russia says they have sent the squadrons of strike bombers and ballistic Iskander missiles to Crimea in response to the deployment that they are seeing by NATO's anti-missile shield in Romania. Now, what does this signaling by Russia mean for the security of the entire region? To discuss this and more, we will be talking to our guest. And with this, let me welcome the first guest, who is Mr. Viktorovich. He's a political analyst who is joining us from Moscow. Welcome to Newswire. So, Mr. Victor, do you think this has changed the balance of powers in the region when it comes to this recent move by Russia?
Well, Russia never sought to change the balance of power in Europe. Russia never took aggressive steps against its European neighbors or against the United States. In fact, it was Washington and some of its European allies that initiated aggressive steps towards Russia, starting with NATO expansion to the east in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and then with Washington abrogating the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. And now, just recently, several weeks ago, Washington again abrogating the treaty, the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Missile Treaty, that was concluded in 1987. And these steps by Washington have been changing the balance of power, have been intended to change the balance of power in Europe to the benefit of Washington and its NATO allies. And of course, Russia has to take steps to counterbalance that. Russia never wanted to take aggressive steps towards Washington or its allies, but seeing that Washington is acting against Russia's interests, Russia is essentially forced to take countermeasures to restore the balance of power in Europe.
Now, Mr. Victor, one of the reasons that the Trump administration gave for withdrawing from the INF Treaty were allegations on Russia for continuing to secretly develop those long-range missiles that the INF categorically blocked, basically warned against. So was there any weightage in those allegations?
No, in fact, it was the United States that was breaking the norms of the INF Treaty signed in 1987. In fact, just as the United States announced that it was withdrawing from the INF Treaty, the American officials have already said that the missile that are already prepared, and they are going to test them in a few months. So it is quite obvious that these missiles that they are intending to test in several months could not be designed.
But isn't that also what senior Russian defense ministry officials are also saying, that they are already, those missiles are also ready and to be tested in a few weeks? Isn't that true for the case of Russia also?
Russia is not yet ready to test the intermediate or smaller range missiles at this point. The United States was the first to announce that. And these moves are not to the benefit of Europe. They are not to the benefit of European allies of the U.S. In essence, the American decision to leave the INF Treaty places European nations in a position of hostage, because if these missiles are used at any point, then it will be the European countries where these missiles are going to be placed by the United States that will suffer. And so these moves by Washington are not only intended against Russian interests, but they are also essentially intended against the interests of Europe, and they are intended also to bring European states that may have been seeking more sovereignty from Washington closer to Washington's orbit.
So we are now, in your opinion, witnessing the beginning of another escalation of tensions between the two, U.S. and Russia.
Unfortunately, yes. And the reason that the United States is doing this is because Washington wants to repeat its success of the early 1980s. I want to bring us back to the early 1980s with the missile crisis of 1983, 1984, when the United States started placing its Pershing intermediate-range missiles in Germany, and the Soviet Union also responded with placing its own intermediate-range missiles on its western borders. And that crisis led to Russia spending more resources on building its missile capability, and the United States believed that placed budgetary constraints and negatively affected the Soviet economy, which was to the benefit of the United States. So today, Washington seeks to repeat that Cold War policy of the early 1980s, that policy that Washington believes led to the end of the Cold War on its terms, led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And so the United States believes that if it repeats many of it's not just the missile policy, but some others too, concerning Russia at this point, that it will lead to a similar result. But Russia has learned from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. Russia does not intend to repeat those mistakes that of the Soviet Union of the early 1980s. And Russia does not intend to spend a significant amount of resources on counteracting the American threat with a similar intermediate-range missile systems. Rather, Russia has developed its own asymmetric systems that are already able to counteract the American anti-ballistic missile systems that are in place in Romania and possibly will be in place in Poland in the coming months and years.
Right. No, it's interesting that you mentioned this, because it was just today earlier when President Putin basically warned the U.S. and says, don't put any more missiles in Europe. We have, the Russian state media basically said that we have a list of U.S. targets that we are ready to point these missiles at. Doesn't that sound rather threatening to you?
If the United States directly against Russia by placing its missiles on the territory of European states close to Russia's borders, then of course Russia will respond accordingly. And Russia at this point has in its arsenal missiles that are able to counteract American anti-ballistic missile systems in Eastern Europe and reach targets in the United States in short order. So these are not threats from the Russian government. These words are intended to cool down the temper in Washington and to point out to those in Washington who believe that they can break through Russian missile defense that mutually assured destruction is as pertinent today as it was in the 1970s and as it was in the 1980s. And
well,
Russia intends to guarantee peace.
If this is an intention to cool down, if the intention is to cool down tensions between US and Russia, is clearly not a very good way to go, obviously, because, I mean, these supersonic missiles, we're talking about speeds more than 9 times the speed of sound here. So when they talk about US targets, it doesn't seem like an attempt to bring tensions down, does it? It seems very aggressive.
Russian troops are not stationed on the border of the United States. Russian troops are not on the Mexican-American border. American troops are on the border between the Baltic states and Russia. American troops are on the border between Poland and Russia. Russia did not abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. It was the United States, the George Bush Jr. administration, that abrogated that treaty. Russia did not initiate breaking up the INF Treaty. It was the United States that took the initial step to abrogate the INF Treaty. So every time it is the United States that takes aggressive action and aggressive steps towards Russia.
Okay.
Every time it is Washington that seeks to change the balance of power with Russia, and Russia is essentially forced to respond accordingly, even though it is in Russia's national interest to have very good relations with Washington and to have very good relations with its European partners.
Okay, one last question. These bombers that Russia has just deployed, they're capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Is there a chance that those weapons would also come with the bombers when they are sent to Crimea?
Well, Crimea is an integral part of the Russian Federation. It is sovereign territory of Russia, and Russia has the right to place any weapon systems and any military systems on any part of its territory, and to conduct exercises or otherwise deploy various aircraft or missile systems on any part of its sovereign territory, just as any other country, including the United States. So Russia reserves the right to defend itself and to take defensives on its own territory in any manner that it pleases.
Okay. Now we are joined by Mr. Pervez Hoodbhoy. He's an academic and also a nuclear expert. Welcome to Newswire, Mr. Hoodbhoy. You're obviously abreast with the information, the news coming out of Russia deploying as a response to US deployment of missiles in Romania. Now, as the situation seems to be escalating since both of them have removed themselves from the INF Treaty, Russia says that US's presence building up a missile system in Romania is a serious challenge. Do you see it that way, or is there another reason for them to respond?
Well, first a little correction over here. This is an anti-ballistic missile system that the United States is placing in Romania. And the stated purpose of that is to counter rogue strikes, what America calls rogue strikes. So missiles originating perhaps from North Korea or from Iran. But as yet, of course, those countries, and certainly Iran, is not capable of that. So Russia sees this as a way of countering its ballistic missile force. And so it has reacted very strongly, first of all, to the United States' withdrawal from the INF Treaty, which had as its purpose regulating intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Europe. Now, since Donald Trump unilaterally abrogated it, and this in spite of many reservations, both in the US military and among Democrats, and of course the Europeans were horrified by this. Well, then Russia also pulled out of the INF, and now it's deployed these Tupolev bombers, and so things have escalated. And I would put the blame primarily on the United States for having abrogated the INF Treaty.
And it seems from reports coming in that this, when you mentioned that it abrogated the treaty, that this was going on for quite some time. However, it's continued to blame Russia for having secretly violated the treaty on its own by building up a long-range ballistic missile system. Do you see any weightage in US's claim?
Well, certainly there is a very strong impetus under Vladimir Putin to give Russia muscle again. And one saw this immediately after the annexation of Crimea. And that, of course, got the Europeans very scared. But still, the hope was that the treaties which had been negotiated at the end of the Cold War would continue to hold. But then comes along Donald Trump and says, no, we don't care for what the Europeans think, we don't care for what the world thinks, and we're going to get rid of all these arms control treaties, those which hamper America's superiority, military superiority in the world. So well, of course, there's action and reaction, and this is what we're seeing in place now.
So there seems to be a chain reaction now where Arsenal continues to build up, and it comes at a time where obviously US and Russia, as usual, are on opposite sides of the spectrum when it comes to Syria and other issues. Now, Europe here seems to be the most vulnerable when it comes to these missile systems. Is there a real threat from Russia to them as a result, as we see the response?
Well, we have to remember that there is a long history of Russia, the Soviet Union, being aggressive, and this was particularly evident in the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And so the Europeans are, of course, very scared about this, and this is why NATO was created as a means of deterring the Soviets from invading Europe. So there are countries that are in the front line, and they are particularly scared, well, Poland being, of course, the obvious example. But now Russia has found there's a resurgent Russia, resurgent under Vladimir Putin, and clearly it's looking for its being a replacement of the Soviet Union. If you've asked me whether Europe should be scared of Russia, and I don't think that this is now an expansionist Russia. Sure, they went into Crimea, because historically they believed that Crimea was a part of Russia, and certainly there was some resistance from Crimeans, but then a lot of Crimeans did welcome the Russian annexation. So it's a complicated story in Crimea, but in the rest of Europe, I do not see that Russia would be expansionist. And certainly the Soviet Union, except for Czechoslovakia, which I did mention, was kept in check.
But there's also a history. Besides the history, there's also Russia is being cornered from all sides economically. Also, they're suffering quite a bit with the sanctions being imposed by Russia, by US, EU. I mean, there's obviously a sort of a fallout from that, is there?
Russia depends upon the sale of its gas to Europe, and there is economic interdependence. Therefore, it would be very foolish, I would think, for Russia to take on Europe. And besides, Europe is not a small power. The EU has got is the second largest or third largest economic unit in the world, and much larger than Russia is. So I don't believe that Russia is out to annex or to attack any country in Europe. It is reacting, however, to the aggressive tone of Donald Trump and the conflicts that exist around the globe, particularly Syria now.
And also, I mean, there is a concern, and why this comes up, because these bombers that Russia has decided to deploy, these long-range missile-carrying bombers, can carry, as I understand, nuclear warheads, correct?
That is correct. On the other hand, I don't know if it makes a lot of military sense to deploy these bombers close in Crimea. After all, they are then within the range of warships, American warships, in the Black Sea. Also, there is no advantage to stationing these bombers there. Let's remember that these are supersonic bombers. They fly at twice the speed of sound. And that means that they can launch their missiles just from practically anywhere. So putting them in harm's way, close to where artillery or missiles from ships in the Black Sea could hit them, doesn't make very much military sense. However, it is a signaling move. This is what
signaling move. It's interesting you say that, because you see in the Russian in the Russian state-run media, now reports are being shown where U.S. targets have lists of U.S. targets that Russia would target if there were to go nuclear, there was an attack from the U.S., have been started to float up. Now, this obviously signals a kind of another warning sign. Is this something to worry about, or do you think this is just the typical rhetoric we see between these two countries?
It's saber-rattling, basically. Let's remember that nuclear war is not something that any country, not the United States, not Russia, not Europe, contemplates. Because it is once one nuclear weapon is used, then the second, third, and then all of them are likely to get used. And that means pretty much the end of every country. So these are, as I repeat, signaling moves. They are saber-rattling, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be scared of this, because with people like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and I think both of them are dangerous individuals,
but they're also very smart politicians at the same time. Is there something that we can expect out of this, something positive to come out? Can we see the world community raising their heads and sort of pushing them towards a new treaty, maybe?
I hope this will result in a revival of the peace movement in the United States and Europe. But right now, I think the world seems to be too preoccupied with other problems. And it's not like the 1980s when you had the largest ever demonstration in the United States, and that had 1 million people marching in New York. I don't see that sort of thing coming about, but it is certainly getting the rest of the world very alarmed. And we know that in the United Nations, there was a resolution passed by, I believe it is 130 countries or so, declaring nuclear weapons to be illegal. And so there is fear and alarm in the rest of the world. Now it remains to be seen whether the major powers, the ones who actually have nuclear weapons and have deployed them, are willing to take note.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoodbhoy, for joining us here on Newswire. With that, we've come to the end of the show. We'll see you next week. Till then, keep watching Indus News for your updates. Goodbye.